Welcome to the Fear and Greed Daily Interview. I'm Sean Aylmer. It's always fascinating watching a new government finding its feet in Canberra, navigating question time, introducing its legislative agenda, figuring out where the sticking points will be and who will be the troublemakers in a new parliament. The Albanese government's coming at it from a somewhat unusual position too, having conducted a massive foreign relations blitz since the election. Plus, Anthony Albanese has the highest satisfaction rating of any new PM, according to Newspoll. Quite the honeymoon. The Nine Network's political editor, Chris Uhlmann, is my guest again this morning. Chris, welcome back to Fear and Greed, and thanks for being here.
G'day, Sean. Good to be with you.
So, how would you rate the performance of the government in the first couple of weeks of Parliament?
Oh, look, I think it's been a very solid beginning for the Albanese government. I think that all of the overseas travel that he did was absolutely necessary, and even the opposition leader agreed with that. We live in very difficult and dangerous times in the most contested region on earth at the moment, and we do need to come to terms with that. I wouldn't say, by the way, that the former government did a bad job with that. And one of the reasons that Anthony Albanese was mostly well met everywhere he went was that Australia does have good relationships, obviously not with France. And that was one of those ones that did need to be repaired. And the relationship with China is always going to be the most difficult one for any Australian Prime Minister. But I think that that was all well handled. And on a domestic front, I think there genuinely was a kind of huge sigh of relief for most of the population with the end of the Morrison government. Across the board, we saw that government bleed seats not just to the Labor Party, but to the Greens and to the Teals. So there was a genuine mood for change. It just wasn't as much as what we normally see to the other side of politics. It sprayed in a number of different directions, which shows us that the parties of government will need to rethink how they do business.
Okay, let's go through some of the issues. Climate change was the big one. The Greens agreed to support the government's carbon reduction legislation. Now, it didn't go as far as the Greens wanted, and obviously they hold the balance of power in Senate. Do you think it's the end of the climate wars, as the Prime Minister said, or do you think we've got a way to go?
I think we've got quite a long way to go on this front because, of course, it is between those who have to run the country and those who want us to be more ambitious. One of the things I do wish that we had in this debate was some sense of how difficult this transition will be and how expensive it will be. And I think you need to look no further than what's going on in Europe at the moment. You know, if you want to look at a country that was being praised around the world for what it was doing on its transition to renewable energies, then no one did more than Germany. It spent more than 500 billion euros over the past 20 years, putting more renewable energy on its grid. It's cost a fortune. They had the highest electricity price on earth before they had problems with the Ukraine war, and it was clear that the only way that that system works is with Russian gas. And so, you know, the transition actually will be difficult, and this is where I think the problem will lie in future for the government. It's, I think, got a reasonable ambition for 2030. The transition in the electricity sector is hard enough, but then we need to look at industrial production, and that's actually 80% of the problem. How we make plastic, how do we make steel? So those who demand much more rapid ambition actually don't, it seems to me, understand how the world works.
Yeah. Okay, another big issue we'll be hearing plenty about is the referendum on an Indigenous voice. The Prime Minister has released a wording of the referendum question. We don't know when that will be put to the population. What's your take on that? It still has a long way to go to actually be enshrined in the Constitution or in law.
Yeah, and look, and I think Anthony Uhlmann, again, is striking all the right tones, and he's right in saying this is something we've got to stop talking about and start doing. You know, the original sin of settlement is dispossession. First Australians do need to be recognised in the Constitution. I think the issue is going to be about the complication of talking about a voice to Parliament without actually having that defined. I can understand why people would say, well, we need to just basically get the sentiment done, but we're talking about a change to the Constitution. And if it gets confusing, I think that there will be reticence in enough of the community to make this really quite problematic. So this is a long and difficult road. I think it starts with the government trying to educate people exactly what's going on. I would hazard a guess that 95% of the population really doesn't know what anyone's talking about this, and hasn't engaged with the conversation. Now they all are going to have a vote on it. So I think the government has a big job of work to do. It needs to make sure that the coalition's on side. It needs to, I think, be a bit more specific about what it is it's going to be doing in terms of what that voice looks like and how it interacts with our Constitution, because once it's in, it's never coming out.
Stay with me, Chris. We'll be back in a minute. My guest this morning is the Nine Network's political editor, Chris Uhlmann. Okay, now talking about sort of big jobs and long roads ahead, the economy. I think that the Albanese government thus far has had a great run, but the economy is really going to test it. High inflation, rising interest rates, a huge government debt. You've got a budget in the next couple of months where Treasurer Jim Chalmers certainly isn't talking about handing out goodies. He's talking about the opposite, taking the punch bowl away in a sense. What's your take? I mean, how do you think they'll go managing the economy, which, at least in the public's perception, is not where Labor is strongest?
Well, this will be its greatest test. This is where the rubber hits the road. It hasn't at the moment, but don't forget, in the lead up to the election, the Labor Party slogan was, everything is going up except your wages. Well, it turns out that's going to be true now for at least the next couple of years. Your wages might rise, but they won't rise faster than inflation. And that's the pinch point for people. You know, they will see themselves going backwards. If they see themselves going backwards over 3 years, if energy prices continue to be on the march, interest rates get back to, which is, let's face it, somewhere near normal. We've had ridiculously low interest rates, and that's part of the problem we've got in the world at the moment. So you can see a circumstance where you'd have to worry that the Albanese government has walked into 1972, like the Uhlmann government, just before an energy shock hit the world that then caused massive inflation, which was persistent for a very long time. Now, the structures of the world are a little different than they were then. You've got to be a bit more optimistic that the inflation won't go as high as it did then. But if it goes, to 8% by the end of the year and it stays there and takes a long time to come down over the next 2 or 3 years, and people's wages don't go ahead at the same time as we have some real issues in the energy sector, and the cost of electricity goes through the roof as well, which drives up prices for everything else, you can see a world of pain for any government in trying to explain to the people that, that there wouldn't have been any different should anyone else have been in. So, I think that the coalition has so many problems at the moment now, it's almost impossible to imagine them coming back in the space of 3 years. But you can see real threats to the government on the horizon, and they are mostly economic.
How effective do you think the leader of the opposition, Peter Dutton, will be, not just in providing opposition to the government, but also rebuilding the coalition or the Liberal Party?
Yeah, and they are gutted and aimless at the moment, as quite often the case. I mean, if you were to look on the bright side, you could say, look, rewind the clock to 2007 when Kevin Rudd won that election. And of course, he was untouchable at the time. It seems much like now. Then the most senior Liberal in the country was Campbell Newman, who was Lord Mayor of Brisbane. Every state and territory in Australia was run by the Labor Party. And we thought they were out of office forever. And within 3 years, there'd been enough problems inside the government to put them back in play. I don't know that we're in that position at the moment. I think that there are structural problems inside the coalition that need to be addressed. They have to fix what is genuinely a women problem in that party. Like, you look down at Parliament now, and particularly given that they've lost so many seats, the contrast between the crossbench and Labor and the coalition now is stark. It is a blue-grey world of male suits. Now, they have to fix their party. They have to decide, two parties, by the way, they have to decide what it is they are in the modern world, what positions they can sensibly hold, and how it is they appeal to a younger and more female audience so that they can actually start to change the way that they look. That's a big project. And, one of the things I think that's not being done in most political parties is a whole lot of thinking about the basics, but that's where they need to start.
You mentioned the crossbenchers. We've already seen a pretty fiery exchange between Dr. Monique Ryan and members of the coalition in Parliament over COVID-19. How do you think question time will change with so many independents sitting on those crossbenches, or Greens and independents?
Yeah, well, the dynamic changes simply because the coalition won't get as many questions as an opposition normally would, because now you have to take into account the fact that the call will be going to the crossbenchers, which are Greens and independents, which means that that's taken as, the next call goes to the government. So the government keeps the same number of questions, but the number of questions between the other side of the house is essentially split. So it changes that dynamic to start with. So that does, again, pose more just a tiny little structural problem for the coalition. And then everyone talks about the tone in Parliament. Like, frankly, I sometimes think that's overdone. I don't know that it's that offensive for people to have arguments, even loud arguments in Parliament, because let's face it, they disagree quite strongly on some things, and we want that kind of contest. So, they need to find their mark. And question time is a one-sided race. Really, what happens is you bowl up a 30-second question, and then if the minister's any good, they bat it out of the park. Yep. It's not actually a debate. What they need to do is to work on some kind of strategy where they can put pressure on the government over time.
And Chris, I can't let you go without talking about China. It's one of your areas of expertise. The challenges for Canberra in dealing with Beijing. Obviously, this week we've seen US House Speaker Nancy Pelosi visit Taiwan. Beijing is not happy about that. Anthony Albanese seemed to respond caught between a rock and a hard place in a sense, because he wants to be strong about China, but he certainly doesn't want any further tensions in the region. What's your take on all that?
Well, between a rock and a hard place is Australia's place now. This is where we will find ourselves for decades to come. And we find ourselves in a circumstance which we have never faced before, which is that our major trading partner is not a liberal democracy, and it is in a strategic competition with our major ally. And this is actually a contest over values. And China does intend to change the world to make it more acceptable for the kind of country that China is, which means changing the rules that we've worked under since the Second World War, which were essentially set up by the liberal democracies after the Second World War in the image and likeness of themselves. Now, China's certainly within its rights to do that, to try, because, a superpower, it's not a superpower yet, but that's its arc, and it gets to make the rules of the road. Those rules of the road will not suit us. Now, the best thing we can possibly hope for is that we manage to maintain our independence in an environment which will undoubtedly change around us, but we actually have to be prepared to act on our own if necessary, because one thing that China is betting on is that the United States is in decline. Now, let's hope that that isn't the case. Sometimes it shows all the signs that it is in decline. So I think that a wise government in Australia would actually have to make bets based on the fact that we need to be able to stand on our own 2 feet in a very changed world, and at least keep the basics, which is that at the end of this century, if we're still a liberal democracy, then we'll have been doing very well.
Chris, thank you for talking to Fear and Greed.
Thanks, mate.
That was the Nine Network's political editor, Chris Uhlmann. This is the Fear and Greed Daily Interview. Join us every morning for the full episode of Fear and Greed, Australia's most popular business podcast. I'm Sean Aylmer. Enjoy your day.